Good morning and welcome to the 15th meeting of the Citizens Participation and Public Petitions Committee in 2025. We're still hoping and expecting the Deputy Convener to join us, but we will start proceedings notwithstanding. And the first of the items on our agenda this morning is the consideration of continued petitions. And I just would like to highlight to all of us joining us this morning or who are watching online that we have a large number of open petitions still to consider before the dissolution of the Parliament in the last working week being the week ending the 26th of March next year. So our focus for the rest of this Parliament is now on identifying any areas where we can feel we can make progress on a petition in the time remaining to us, given that that's not that many meetings of the committee ahead. The first of the petitions before us this morning is petition number 1865 to suspend all surgical mesh and fixation devices, lodged by Rosanna Clarkin and Lauren McDougall, and it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to suspend the use of all surgical mesh and fixation devices while a review of all surgical procedures which use polyester, polypropylene or titanium is carried out, and guidelines for the surgical use of mesh are established. And we're joined this morning by a long-standing colleague with interest in these matters, Jackie Bailey. Good morning to you, Jackie. We last considered this petition on the 19th of February 2025, when we discussed about potentially closing the petition. We ultimately agreed to write to the Scottish Government to try and get a bit more information on the question of data. Now, we have received a response from the Minister for Public Health and Women's Health, and while committing to keep emerging evidence under review, the Minister states that the Scottish Health Technologies Group, SHTG, analysed the most relevant research on the use of mesh for hernia repair, and that evidence published since 2021 aligns with the SHTG advice, both in terms of outcomes and patient follow-up. The Scottish Government is further guided by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, our old friends, the MHRA, saying that there is currently no evidence on which to base further regulatory action for surgical mesh. The Minister also references the National Institute for Health and Care and Excellence, NICE, which regularly reviews evidence to update its clinical guidance, including in terms of hernia repair. The Minister's response then highlights a series of programmes in progress which provide data for medical devices, including pelvic and hernia mesh, both at a UK and a Scottish level. It also points to the open initiative of the Evidence Directorate within Healthcare Improvement Scotland, whereby anyone can propose guideline topics or request research to be considered in Scottish clinical guidelines. The petitioners reiterate their view that the SHTG recommendations are based on incomplete and outdated data. They also believe that meaningful action is yet to materialise in terms of clear patient pathways for hernia mesh injured individuals and in guidelines for the use of mesh, suggesting there are still patients who are neither being offered non-mesh alternatives nor receiving fully informed consent. May I say, just before I invite Jackie Bailey to comment, that I raised the issue of mesh, particularly with regard to the two reports commissioned by the Scottish Government by the late Professor Alison Britton, and the First Minister offered to meet me, which he did at the start of this, the post-recess, with both himself and the Minister and also all the relevant officials, and has subsequently written to me with a very detailed outline of all the work that has been done in relation to the implementation of these two reports. I have to say there are still some gaps in all of that, so it will require some follow-up evidence. I'm also going to be going to London in order to pursue, with relevant authorities there, progress in relation to the Hughes recommendations on compensation for mesh. Jackie Bailey.
Well, what can I add, Convener, to what you've already said? Because I think you have been tireless in pursuing this petition, and yourself, Alex Neil, former Health Secretary, and my former colleague Neil Finlay campaigned alongside the mesh injured women and championed their cause, and clearly you continue to do so today. I think there's been some action taken by the government. I would concede that. We've seen a specialist clinic, we've seen access to mesh removal abroad. Waiting lists do remain too long. and some women are still waiting. But the issue for me is the continuing use of mesh, whether it's in hernia operations or others, and I am persuaded by both your efforts and the response from the petitioners that we should keep this petition open because the information is outdated. Clearly, your meeting with the First Minister was very welcome, but it throws up some gaps that I hope that the Petitions Committee would explore further. And so I would, really suggest we keep this open because the job is not quite yet done. And on that basis, I would commend the committee to do exactly that.
I have a great deal of sympathy with that. On the other hand, however, I think we probably are at a stage in the Parliament where it will have to be the efforts of individual members that take these things forward. I'm not certain that there's more that the committee can do. The Scottish Government has said it's guided by the SHTG and MHRA and NICE and its current review approach to evidence, which it will keep under review. There are a number of ongoing programmes which provide comprehensive data for medical devices, including pelvic and hernia MASH, and there is an option to address proposals for the development of genuine guideline topics directly via Healthcare Improvement Scotland. And I feel I've got to, just because we're running out of time, close this petition, not because I think the issues have been fully addressed, but because I think potentially a fresh petition in the next Parliament could focus in on what thereafter are the remaining items, because there is a division of opinion, which even those of us who have had major concerns about the use of mesh in relation to its application in hernia operations. I think our Deputy Convener himself said that he's benefited from that. So nonetheless, I think there are issues that remain. These can be pursued, I think, by members who have an interest in the balance of this Parliament, and I hope and would expect that the wider issues that might remain might therefore be raised by a fresh petition in the new year. So, notwithstanding, are members content at this stage to conclude that there's nothing further we can do as a committee in relation to this petition in the time left available to us? Yes? I can barely. My glasses are fogged up, Mr. Ewing, so you'll need to shout out because I can hardly see you.
With considerable regret, because I think the points that yourself and Jackie Bailey have made are apposite as usual, and there's most of the parties, I think, support the general tenor of it. So it's extremely disappointing that more hasn't been done. But at the same time, we don't have executive power in this committee, and we're near the fag end of the Parliament. So the incoming administration, whoever that is going to have to take this on, I think, and no doubt another petition can be brought forward by petitioners early on if they so wish.
Well, I do want to say that the First Minister's interest was genuine. It was the first time he'd fully engaged on the subject. But even though I've received a comprehensive letter, when I ask for an itemised check off against each of the recommendations, it can be somewhat grouped in general, which isn't necessarily as reassuring as it might be. So there are some further written questions, I think, that can be put by me in relation to all of these and by other colleagues. Thank you. Our second petition then is petition number 1979. Oh, a great year. Establish an independent inquiry and an independent national whistleblowing officer to investigate concerns about the alleged mishandling of child safeguarding inquiries by public bodies. And this petition has been lodged by Neil McLennan, Christine Scott, Alison Dickey and Bill Cook, many of whom have joined us from time to time as we've considered this petition, and of course all of whom had an opportunity to address the committee. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to launch an independent inquiry to examine concerns that allegations about child protection, child abuse, safeguarding and children's rights have been mishandled by public bodies, including local authorities and the General Teaching Council for Scotland, the GTCS, gaps in the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, and establish an independent national whistleblowing officer for education and children's services in Scotland to handle all of these inquiries in future. Now, we're joined by our MSP colleague Edward Mountain for the consideration of this petition this morning. Good morning, Mr. Mountain. We last considered it on the 5th of February, and we agreed then to write to the Minister for Children, Young People and the Promise and to write to the General Teaching Council for Scotland. In her response, the Minister indicates that work is underway to identify potential solutions to the issues raised in her meeting with the petitioners. She also mentions work undertaken alongside the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland to understand current arrangements for whistleblowing and case investigation, and potential improvements to these arrangements. The Minister also highlights other work undertaken to improve child protection, including meetings of the new Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation National Strategic Group. She reiterates the Government's intention to engage with the recommendations of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry once this has concluded, and to keep under review the statutory requirement for mandatory reporting, on which she says stakeholder views have been varied. The GTCS response highlights that a local authority-led process will always be required when investigating concerns, so long as local authorities provide education services and employ teachers in Scotland. It also reiterates its view that a focus on establishing a new whistleblowing officer could draw attention away from identifying where the current gaps are and from implementing effective solutions to fill them. And since reviewing the official GTCS response, the Professional Standards Authority's review of the Fitness to Teach process was published, and GTCS is currently working on an action plan based on the PSA recommendations. Now, the petitioners have welcomed some of the work undertaken, but they continue to highlight the power imbalance against those raising concerns, and that current mechanisms do not provide the level of security required to identify the validity of safeguarding concerns. And I wonder if Edward Mountain would like to address the committee.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I realise the pressure that's on this committee as we come to the end of the Parliament. I would like to go back to a couple of comments that were made when this last came before the committee on the 5th of February, one by Ash Regan, who said that she believes that public bodies are defensive, and also Fergus Ewing, who says that he profoundly agreed that the current system is inherently flawed. That remains my position, and I think that of the petitioners. Convener, since I gave evidence or came to this committee on the 5th of February, more cases have come to light in the Highlands, some of which are deeply concerning to me. Cases of where pupils are being dragged out of classrooms by their feet, and that people have been suspended, but no evidence has been given to why they've been suspended. So as far as their colleagues are concerned, it remains the case that they've done nothing wrong, when the parents and the pupils know they have done something wrong. Which is why I think that we need, more than anything else, this whistleblowing officer to look at it and to address the issues. If we are going to get it right for every child, which we must certainly do, Convener, we need to make sure that children are heard, and that when evidence is given to mistreatment, especially at schools, that evidence is made available when the person is suspended. Because at the moment we have too many teachers, I believe, across Scotland that are getting away because the authorities are hiding behind GDPR regulations which say that they can't disclose while that person's been suspended. Now, I think this will forever go on, Convener, until we get a whistleblowing officer, which is why I'm very keen to make sure that this petition continues. Now, I know, as I said at the outset, Convener, you have issues with timeframes in this committee, but I think the Petitions Committee is the only committee in the Parliament where petitions can be kept open to the next session. And considering that this is the children of Scotland that are affected, I would urge the committee to consider keeping it open, because we haven't got it right at the moment. And I will leave it at that, Convener, because I could get emotional over this, because I think we're letting our children down.
Thank you, Mr. Mountain. Yes, that is an option, but it's one that we would exercise very carefully, because it is not helpful potentially to the next committee in the next session of Parliament if they have a significant body of open petitions before them. Colleagues, do you have any suggestions for action? Fergus Ewing.
Yes, I do speak in support of what my colleague Ed Mountain has said, and I too have constituents who have profound concerns about the way complaints are dealt with. Particularly, they're kept in the dark. No information is ever given to them about anything, and they're left in a situation of feeling completely impotent. Now, that may be because of GDPR, that may be the law, it may not be, I don't know. But what I do know is that the system is inherently wrong, because public bodies are failing to observe the very first basic principle of any justice system, which is nemo iudex in causa sua, or to put it into plain English, they're marking their own jotters. And any public body, when facing criticism, will circle the wagons. It will defend itself. It's an instinct. And then there's an inherent conflict of interest between defending their own interests as a public body and dealing with the complaint of a third party. I mean, it's very, very simple. And this petition, I think, has been on the go for 3 years. And the particular point I wanted to make in supplement to what Mr Mountain has said today, Convener, which I think I drew to your attention, the clerk's attention prior to this meeting, was this. The petitioners have made a supplementary submission of the 23rd of September, fairly recently. In that submission, they make new substantive points. One, the growing support of MSPs, and they mention all the MSPs that support it. And then they talk about the GDC and the patent defects of their filtering out of child safeguarding referrals at the initial stage. And the defects are that they just basically go with what the Education Authority says. So much so that the statistics show, according to their submission, that only 26% of public referrals from members of the public are investigated, and 92% from the employer are investigated. Well, that's a finding of the Professional Standards Authority, which in itself is independent, and which also has criticised the system as the GTS relied solely on referral information. Now, you can't rely in any judicial capacity on only hearing one side of the case, because that's the breach of the other. The other two of the principles of natural law, audi alterum partem, which, as Latin scholars will know, is listen to both sides of the case. I mean, it couldn't be more elementary, and yet 3 years on, we're no further forward. Now, specifically, I accept entirely we're moving towards the end of this session, but there are 6 months left. And I do think, at the very least, Convener, what we should do, and I would hope colleagues feel this is fair, is that given the cross-party support, the obvious strong points, the strong submissions made by the petitioner on the 23rd of September, just very recently, that we should invite the Scottish Government to respond specifically to the points that are made in that submission. And, you know, I do think that in itself is an example that, as a Petitions Committee, we must ensure that the Scottish Government respond to the other side of the case. So I know we're under a lot of pressure to close petitions, and I won't be arguing that every petition should be kept open. Just 2 this morning, I think, which is a very modest bag for me, but I think this is one of them, because it's an extremely strong case, and 3 years later, we're not really any further forward. We're just not.
Thank you, Mr Ewing. Well, if I may trade Latin, tempus fugit.
Well, festina lenti, you know.
Mr Ewing has recommended that we invite the Scottish Government to respond to the petitioner's latest submission. Our colleagues, Mr Russell.
Yeah. Is there not another public body? I'm thinking about education as a public service. Could the Public Services Ombudsman not take this role on? Because it is a public service, it's been provided, and there's a flaw in the public service, and that is their role.
Well, I think that might be beyond the scope of the committee's ability to properly explore. So, in the first instance, are we happy to pursue Mr Ewing's suggestion, and then we will have a further opportunity to decide whether, as I think Mr Ewing is suggesting, this might be one of our legacy petitions, as Mr Mountain was hoping it might be, or whether we feel it would be best served by a fresh petition in the next Parliament. But we will write to the Scottish Government seeking a response to the petitioner's latest submission. Are colleagues content to proceed on that basis? We are. Thank you very much, Mr Mountain. Petition number 2056 to introduce legislation allowing Scottish ministers to intervene on the hire of public land. The next continued petition is from Stephen Gold, and it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to introduce legislation providing ministers with the power to call in and potentially override council decisions on the hire of public land for large-scale events. We last considered this petition on the 5th of February 2025, when we agreed to write to the Scottish Government. The response from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government states that the Scottish Tourism Alliance submission does not change the Scottish Government's previously stated position. The Government would not consider introducing the mechanism asked for in the petition, since that would go against the principles set out in the Verity House Agreement, under which it committed to respecting local government's democratic mandate and vice versa. Didn't know that was still a thing. For the same reason, the Scottish Government would not pass judgment on which may or may not be a sound reason for refusing an application at a local level. The petitioner's additional submission details his recent experiences when attempting to hire land for events, which he found demoralising and expensive. Do members have any comments or suggestions for action? Mr. Golden, thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I think, given the stage in the session, the committee should close the petition under Rule 15.7 of the Standing Orders, as the Convener has highlighted, on the basis that the Scottish Government has reiterated its commitment to the Verity House Agreement, and thereby it will not intervene in decisions regarding the hire of public land owned by local authorities.
Are colleagues content to proceed on that basis? So, given the position that the committee is in, as I've outlined, we close the petition on that basis at that time. Thank you. We are expecting petitioners to join us this morning in relation to the centralisation of specialist neonatal units in NHS Scotland, and I know Jackie Bailey is joining us for that petition too, but I am going to hold off a little in the hope and expectation that the petitioners will be able to join us and move. And before I move, can I just say I forgot to mention in relation to the first petition, continued petition we considered this morning, petition number 1865, that Katie Clark had hoped to join us this morning and had submitted a late written submission just at the last when she was unable to do so. Petition number 2129 to standardise criteria and consultations for assessing demand for denominational schools. This has been lodged by Elizabeth Spencer, and it calls on Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to require education authorities to adopt a uniform set of criteria and a standard consultation for assessing community demand for denominational schools. And we wrote to this to the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills after we last considered the petition on the 19th of February this year. The Cabinet Secretary's response states that when establishing a new school, local authorities are required to carry out a consultation under the Schools Consultation Scotland Act of 2010. This consultation has to include at least 30 school days, engage with a specific list of relevant consultees, and include a public meeting. Education Scotland also produces a report about the educational benefit of the proposal, and the local authority has to produce a final report summarising responses to this consultation. The Cabinet Secretary states that she has no evidence to support the view that the current arrangements for the establishment of new schools, including denominational schools, is unfair or inconsistent. The petitioner has provided a written submission which states that in the case of Aberdeen City Council, non-Catholic parents and grandparents were disregarded from the consultation, and she calls for the committee to consider whether the criteria and consultations are being applied consistently and to examine whether the experience of Aberdeen families shows the need for national guidance and oversight. Do members have any comments or suggestions for action? Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Convener. I would recommend that we close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that the Scottish Government is of the view that existing legislation takes into account the needs of communities who wish to establish a denominational school, and that the current framework for decision-making around the establishment of a denominational schools is sufficient.
Thank you, Mr. Golden. Are there any other contributions? Colleagues content to close the petition. So we thank the petitioner for raising the petition, but in light of the Scottish Government's response, don't feel there's anywhere further we could take the petition forward. The next of our continued petitions is petition number 2137, Fair Regulation for Non-Medical Aesthetic Injectors. And this has been lodged by Jordan Morrison on behalf of Mr. Sculpt Aesthetics Limited. the petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to introduce an aesthetics licensing scheme to ensure that non-medical practitioners meet training and safety standards. We last considered this petition on the 5th of March, where we agreed to write to the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Government has since written to the committee on 2 occasions. The most recent submission sets out that the Scottish Government has published the analysis of the consultation on the regulation of non-surgical cosmetic procedures and its intended next steps. The Scottish Government intends to introduce a non-surgical cosmetic procedures bill which will ensure that many non-surgical cosmetic procedures are undertaken by or under the supervision of a healthcare professional, and in most cases in a setting regulated by Healthcare Improvement Scotland. In addition, the Scottish Government intends to pursue secondary legislation under the Civic Government Scotland Act 1982 to establish a local authority licensing regime for procedures which do not require the input of a healthcare professional. Well, in view of the fact that it would appear that many of the aims of the petition have been realised, do comments have any suggestions for action? Mr Golden?
Thank you, Convener. As per your remarks, I think ultimately the Scottish Government is committed to meeting the ask of the petitioner, which I think is a positive result, and therefore I would recommend that we close the petition under Rule 15.7 of the Standing Orders, as per my earlier comments that the Scottish Government have made such a commitment.
Thank you, Mr Golden. Our colleagues content. Mr Ewing.
I wouldn't demur from that recommendation, but just say that I think the controversy around the expected content of the Scottish Government bill will not recede. It may intensify, actually, once people grasp that it may not achieve what a great many people believe it should achieve and want to achieve. However, that may just be a personal observation, and I think for the reasons that you and Mr Golden have said, that there's nothing further that we can really do with it at this stage.
Thank you, Mr Ewing. Our colleagues content? We are. I'm going to suspend consideration of item 1 for a little while as we move to item 2, which is the consideration of new petitions. And just a what? Suspend the meeting. Before I introduce the first of the new petitions, I should begin by highlighting to those following today's proceedings that a considerable amount of work is done in advance of the consideration of each petition. We invariably invite the Independent Research Service, SPICE, within the Scottish Parliament to offer a briefing in relation to the issues raised by the petition, and we get an initial view from the Scottish Government. And we do both these things because it has historically been the case that the committee would initiate those two as the first actions on the first consideration of the petition, so we simply get to the point of being better informed at an earlier stage. The first of these petitions is now 2166, which is to establish a standardised timeframe for civil proceedings in child custody cases, and it's lodged by John Watson McMaster, and it calls on the Scottish Parliament to establish a standardised timeframe for civil proceedings relating to child custody cases, including a 14-day timeframe for proof hearings. Now, the SPICE briefing explains that Section 11 of the Children's Scotland Act 1995 gives the court various powers to decide an issue in a dispute about parental responsibilities and rights. The briefing states that relatively few Section 11 cases tend to get as far as a proof hearing. Instead, they are typically settled during child welfare hearings, which are relatively informal private proceedings. The briefing also notes that there have been long-standing policy concerns about delays in cases affecting children, including in Section 11 cases, and inconsistencies in respect of how such cases are managed. To address this, the Children's Scotland Act 2020, when in force, will require the court to consider whether any delay in proceedings would negatively affect a child's welfare. The length of delay is not specified, with the explanatory note stating that the length would vary from case to case. The Scottish Government's response to the petition states that it does not consider the specific asks of the petition to be practical or achievable. The submission notes that a standardised timetable would not recognise the different complexities of individual cases. The submission also highlights the case management rules in place for family actions, which includes a key aim of bringing greater judicial case management to resolve cases more quickly. Now, the petitioner has provided a written submission calling for the committee to reconsider the timeframe set out in the petition. Following a meeting with the Scottish Government, he is now calling for a considered timeframe of 4 to 6 weeks rather than 14 days for a proof hearing, and he states that this timeframe is pragmatic as it aligns with operational realities of the courts while still drastically accelerating the process, protects child welfare by prioritising swift resolution, and improves the system efficiency by reducing opportunistic and malicious litigation. The petitioner's submission also states that the core issue is not a lack of rules, but a systemic failure to enforce them consistently, and he believes the social damage caused by these procedural failures is measurable, not only in the immense emotional toll on families, but also in the long-term costs to public services, including mental health support and social work intervention. So do colleagues have any comments or suggestions for action in the light of what we've received? Mr. Ewing?
Well, this is an area where family actions, where I used to be involved in acting as a solicitor, are not only about child's welfare, but very often about the relations broken down between the husband and wife, and therefore ancillary to divorce proceedings. And they can be extremely difficult and fraught with emotional intensity and strong feelings on either side. So many of the delays that result in these cases result not from the courts, but from the reluctance of the parties to come to a deal. And in saying that, I don't make any judgments on anybody, but that's just how it works, or doesn't work. I think it would be interesting to know, with regard to the Children Scotland Act 220, when this is going to come in force and what the plans are, because the advice we've had from the clerks is that this would require the court to consider whether any delay in proceedings could negatively affect the child's welfare. Now, that seems to be a power that would be very useful. In other words, if there was an inordinate delay going on for years and years and the child's welfare were suffering as a result, understandably, then it does seem sensible that, as the law has been passed in 220, that law should come into force. So I think it would be good, Convener, to ask the Scottish Government, at the very least, when is this going to come into force? Because if they're saying it's something that should be taken account of here, then we're entitled to know when it will become the law. And secondly, I think the Scottish Government should also be asked for their views on the petitioner's revised deadline of 4 to 6 weeks as opposed to 14 days. I suspect the answer will be much the same, and I suspect that there are pretty good practical reasons that any deadline of this nature may be arbitrary in some cases and therefore produce potential adverse anomalies and consequences. But it would be useful to just get a bit more detail from the government about that. And you know, at the end of the day, I'm sure the petitioner has got a point that these actions can take years and years, and the victims, the sufferers, are very often the children.
Thank you, Mr. Ewing. It's first consideration of the petition. You have made specific recommendations there. Are the committee content to keep the petition open and to make the inquiries as Mr. Ewing has detailed? We are. Thank you. Petition number 2167 to stop the pavement parking ban for Scottish roads built before 2019. This has been lodged by Donna Ingalls, and the petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to pause the pavement parking ban for all roads built before 2019 and to require all local authorities to carry out an assessment and consultation for any other road where they want to introduce a ban, with the presumption that bans won't be agreed for roads under 6 metres wide. The Scotland-wide prohibition on the parking of motor vehicles on the pavement was introduced in Part 6 of the Transport Scotland Act 2019 and came into force in December 2023. The Spice briefing explains that exemptions to the prohibition apply to certain categories of vehicle in particular circumstances, and that exemption decisions are a matter for each local authority. The Scottish Government's response indicates that the option to allow local authorities to only designate specific roads for pavement parking bans was indeed considered when they were designing the policy, but it was ultimately deemed potentially confusing for drivers. Thus, limiting the ban to roads constructed after 2019 would fail to provide consistent protection for all pavement users. The Government also points out that funding and guidance were allocated to local authorities in advance of the ban to support road assessments and identify potential pavement exemptions. The initial consultation was promoted through a number of channels, and a nationwide campaign was run ahead of the ban coming into force. Finally, the Government indicates that the Parking Standards Group, comprising various stakeholders and including representatives of the local authorities, can address any concerns or clarify issues related to the ban and to any exemptions. In an additional submission, the petitioner lists a number of further issues which she believes have an impact on both local authorities and communities following the introduction of the ban. Do colleagues have any suggestions for action? Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I think the way in which the legislation is applied by local authorities varies considerably, and in many cases, anecdotally, that I've experienced that it's not actually enforced at all. But nonetheless, I think that the committee should close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that while the Scottish Government had considered designating specific roads for pavement parking bans, as highlighted in the petition, it decided this would cause confusion and put pavement users at risk. Furthermore, allowing exemptions for narrow roads is a decision for local authorities. And finally, the Parking Standards Group can address further concerns and clarify issues related to the ban and to any exemptions.
Thank you, Mr. Golden. Are colleagues content to close the petition on that basis? We are, thank you. I'm going to suspend consideration of Agenda Item 2 and revisit Agenda Item 1, which was continuing petitions, and the final of those continuing petitions this morning, for which we've now been joined by petitioners, is petition number 2099 to stop the proposed centralisation of specialist neonatal units and NHS Scotland. This has been lodged by Lynn McRitchie, and it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to stop the planned downgrading of established and high-performing specialist neonatal intensive care services across NHS Scotland from a Level 3 to a Level 2, and to commission an independent review of this decision in light of contradictory expert opinions on centralising services. We last considered this petition on the 11th of September 2024, where we agreed to write to the Minister for Public Health and Women's Health, and the committee also agreed then to undertake a visit to explore the issues raised in the petition. Members of the committee have since visited the neonatal intensive care unit at the University Hospital Wishaw and met with the petitioner families with experience of neonatal intensive care. Wishaw staff and NHS Lanarkshire staff thank you to those individuals who took the time to meet with us. I mean, it really was a tremendous number of people who turned up. I mean, I think those of us from the committee who were present really did value the very personal exchange we were able to have, not just with people who've been affected, but by a very considerable cohort of staff who turned up to speak to us as well. Hearing those experiences and perspectives with direct experience of neonatal care, and some with happy outcomes, some less so. So it really was quite an emotional and highly charged discussion, helped our understanding of the issues raised in the petition. And as I say, we're also very grateful to all those in NHS Lanarkshire and the University Hospital for their work in arranging the visit, which really was a first-class operational opportunity for us all. Now, a note summarising the issues raised during the visit is available on the meeting papers for today and has been published on the petition website. And the Minister for Public Health and Women's Health has provided 2 written submissions since we last considered the petition. The first submission reiterates that the recommendation was based on evidence that outcomes, including survival from the very smallest and sickest babies, are best when they are cared for in units with high volume throughput and where they are collated specialist services. The response states that the review team visited all 14 health boards and met with teams from maternity and neonatal services. The Scottish Health Council led a programme of service user engagement across all NHS territorial boards, which were supplemented with bespoke service user events. The submission states that over 600 staff and 500 service users contributed to the review process. Now, the Minister's most recent submission notes that while the principles underpinning the changes are supported by the Scottish Executive Nurse Directors, SEND, and by the Directors of Midwifery, concerns were raised about the implications of this change for maternity services. The Directors of Midwifery highlighted that additional data and evidence gathering was required for maternity services to inform maternity capacity implementation planning, and the submission states that a national level data collection is underway to understand the impact of the neonatal care remodelling on maternity services. Bliss Scotland has provided a written submission which details its support for the new model of care and shares its view that the volume of babies born needing intensive care in Scotland is far too low to sustain more than 3 NICUs in Scotland. The submission shares concerns that progress is stalling, with a lack of clear communication about the task and Finnish Group's priorities, work plan and progress to date. Bliss believes that ongoing concerns regarding resourcing have not been addressed, including adequate staffing of the 3 designated intensive care units. I should say that there were issues raised in regard to Bliss by those who attended the visit that we held at the hospital. Monica Lennon MSP is unable to attend the meeting this morning and has instead provided a written submission, and the submission states that a truncated process amounts to tokenism, leaving families, clinicians and local representatives feeling betrayed. Ms Lennon's submission calls on the committee to consider recommending that an independent multidisciplinary review be undertaken before Scottish ministers reach a final decision regarding the future of neonatal intensive care services. And I think it is important again to remember that the recommendation wasn't necessarily for 3, it was for a reduction in the number of centres to potentially a lower number, and that it would have been perfectly possible for this particular unit, award-winning unit, to have been retained. Now, Megan Gallagher had hoped to join us this morning for the consideration of this petition, but was unable to do so. But once again, Jackie Bailey is with us, and I wonder if Jackie Bailey would like to address the committee.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I'm going to attempt the impossible, which is to try to get you, as the committee, to keep this petition open. Wishaw Neonatal Unit, as you rightly pointed out, was the best neonatal unit in the country, not Scotland, but the whole of the United Kingdom in 2022. And for some reason, the Scottish Government decided that it should close. Now, you're quite right to reference an earlier report presented to the Scottish Government that recommended that they should have 3 to 5 neonatal units to cover Scotland instead of, I think, the 7 or 8 that we have now. And nobody disagrees with that. What we do disagree with is that they opted to go for 3. 1 in Glasgow, 1 in Edinburgh, 1 in Aberdeen. Lanarkshire, the 3rd largest health board that covers a population of 655,000 people, would have their neonatal unit removed. The evidence, I have to say at the time, in contradiction to what the Minister contends, was partial. There was no voice from NHS Lanarkshire sitting round the decision-making table, but there were representatives from Glasgow Health Board and indeed Lothian as well. I think the thing that we need to hold on to here is that Wishaw Neonatal Unit doesn't just deal with mums and babies from Lanarkshire, it deals with mums covered by Greater Glasgow and Clyde, because the Glasgow units, the 2 Glasgow units that currently are there, do not have enough capacity to cope with the mums and babies from Glasgow. So Lanarkshire plays a key role for the whole of Scotland. And when the neonatal unit closes, mums and babies will either need to go, if not to Wishaw, to Glasgow, potentially to Edinburgh, and certainly it's been talked about Aberdeen would be the default, and we think there's not enough capacity in Glasgow to cope, so you would be putting the sickest babies in ambulances to make the 2.5 to 3 hour journey to Aberdeen to be seen. It is entirely ridiculous, not just because of the risk, but because you are then, with those sickest babies, they're likely to be in hospital for long periods of time. what happens to the mums, the families who are rooted in their community in Lanarkshire? How do they spend time with the baby up in Aberdeen? That would just be impossible and impractical. And it's not just the families who are very pragmatic in resisting these changes, it's the clinicians as well. And I think you saw that very powerfully from your visit when you were there. So the solution, if I can posit one, is that we should have 4 units. It's common sense. It's not rocket science. And I wonder whether we could invite the committee to suggest to the government that they pause any changes, that there should be a fully independent review, that they should actually consult with the clinicians and the families affected in more than just a tokenistic way, and that you write to the Scottish Government inviting them to do that, and perhaps even invite the Minister to come before the committee, because I think that would be a valuable conclusion to your visit that the committee undertook. And to be frank, if we don't keep this petition open, the government will downgrade the neonatal unit between now and May, and that doesn't benefit anybody. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Jackie Bailey. I'm sure when you said you would be putting people in, you were using you in the most general sense.
Absolutely. Not you, Convener.
Not me personally. But I think you make a number of very salient and relevant points. And I would also add that from one of those parents that we heard from, who's in relation to the prospect of the baby being in Aberdeen, that the mother was left in a critical condition and was not going to be transferred with the baby. And in his view, what was he supposed to do? Was he supposed to stay with his wife, who was in a critical condition in Wishaw, or was he supposed to travel to Aberdeen, where the baby would be? And he said it would be a dreadful choice for any husband and father to have to make in those circumstances. Mr. Russell.
Yes, before I say anything, I have a interest in this matter as a constituency matter. But I must say that I agree with everything that Jackie says, and it's not only the parents, the clinicians, but also the public, the citizens in Lanarkshire. It's really a motive for them, and the man box is full of every time there's a mention of it closing. It's a really emotive subject, and it needs to be looked into further. The information needs to be reviewed at minimum.
Thank you. I don't think there's any question, but this is a petition that the committee will want to keep open. And I think it would be the next step. Before we make any further recommendations, I think we need to take some evidence. And I would like to suggest that we do invite the Minister for Public Health and Women's Health to give evidence on this matter, but that we also invite the British Association of Perinatal Medicine Best Start Perinatal Subgroup to come before the committee as well, in order that we can interrogate the process that led to a recommendation for 3 rather than 4 or 5 units, because that seems to be really the critical issue as far as I can see. That it would have been wholly consistent with the original report and recommendation for a 4th unit to be retained. And as Jackie Bailey has said, in such a large health board, with an award-winning facility, and with all the support that there is and all of the issues that have been identified, this seems to have been one that really I think those of us who visited the facility thought ought to have been considered. So we're very sympathetic to the aims of the petition. Our colleagues Mr. Ewing.
Well, I totally agree. I do think that the petition should be kept open and that the evidence should be taken from the Minister. So I'm entirely satisfied with that. I just wanted to make two points. One, that of course if there's to be 3, then that means the whole of the Highlands and Morayshire, Argyll and the islands are not going to have such a facility. And I just should reflect on that, because there's very strong feelings in hospitals there which face potential closure, and that's been a very live issue, particularly in Wick and Elgin over the years. Going back several decades, my late wife was involved in saving the maternity unit in Murray many decades ago. But I did want, the second point, I just wanted to ask, if I may, Jackie Bailey, just to clarify something either now or if she needs to get more information about this later, which is that I think you indicated that the performance of Wishaw was the best, not just in Scotland, but the whole of the UK. And I'd just be interested to know, either now or later, but certainly before we take evidence from the Minister, what the statistical evidential basis is for that judgment, what it's based on. I don't know if you can answer that now, Ms Bailey, or later.
So I am capable of many things, Convener, but that level of detail is not in my gift. I am happy to provide the information.
Yes, that'd be grateful, but actually I think it may also have been one of the issues that was raised when we were on the visit, and I can't specifically remember if we were given detailed information in support of that at the time, but perhaps together with the committee we can, clerks, we can just establish what the situation is with regard to that. It's also important that we just make clear, because it's the downgrading of facilities, not the closure of facilities, because I know that can cause additional alarm to people, but it's the sustaining of specialist units that I think is the core aspect of the ask of this petition. So we're content to keep the petition open. There's a little bit of further information we want, and in the time left to us, we'll be seeking to hold a further evidence session with the Minister and with those who have been involved in the consideration of the recommendations, so that the committee can interrogate both and potentially then make recommendations in respect of the future way forward. Are the committee content to operate and to proceed on that basis? We are. Thank you very much, and thank you. So we move back again to agenda item 2, which is the consideration of new petitions, and the next of those petitions is petition number 2168 to guarantee legal aid for death or serious injury victims in legal action against Police Scotland. This has been lodged by Stephen McInally, and it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to grant legal aid to all victims and their families when medical evidence confirms that a death or serious injury incident occurred during an interaction with Police Scotland personnel. Mandatory FAIs are held into all deaths which occur in legal custody, which includes police and prison custody. The Scottish Government's response to the committee states that it is committed to bringing forward primary legislation that would provide for non-means tested legal aid for families participating in deaths in custody FAIs, including non-means tested advice and assistance from day one. This will be taken forward as part of a programme of wider reform around legal aid in Scotland, which the Scottish Government intends to introduce through a bill in the next Parliament. Do members have any comments or suggestions for action? Mr Russell?
Just to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of the Standing Orders, on the basis that the Scottish Government intends to introduce a bill in the next Parliament to bring forward a programme of legal aid and reform. The committee is limited in the progress it could take in this petition in the time remaining in this parliamentary session.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Mr Golden?
I agree with Mr Russell, but I think we should highlight to the petitioner that the Scottish Government intending to introduce a bill in the next Parliament should not be grounds for any solace, because we do have instances where the Scottish Government have said they would introduce a bill in the actual session in which they are in government and not done so. So actually a commitment to a future government of which we don't know the makeup of shouldn't be grounds for consideration. Nonetheless, I do think that the wider issue of legal aid is incredibly challenging and does need to be looked at by the next Scottish Government.
Thank you very much. A proposal from Mr Russell. Are colleagues content on the basis that has been suggested to close the petition? I believe we are. And I'm just going to briefly suspend this meeting. welcome back. The next petition is petition number 2169 to facilitate a review and upgrade of the teaching resource Palestine and Israel Understanding the Conflict. Before we proceed any further, can I indicate that parliamentary rules are quite clear that if the convener is present at proceedings, the convener must convene proceedings. But in so doing, I now make a declaration of interest that I am the convener of the Scottish Parliament's group Cross Building Bridges with Israel, and that in 2017 I undertook a visit to Israel, which was funded by the Israeli Embassy. I also maintain regular contact with the Israeli Embassy. Indeed, I spoke to them earlier this week in relation to the release of a constituent who was part of a flotilla that was getting itself into some bother. Mr. Ewing?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Can I also declare an interest as the Deputy Convener of the cross-party group on building bridges with Israel? And whereas I think I am capable of coming to a balanced view on the very sensitive issues involved, nonetheless, I decline to do so on this in case it is seen that I am partial and have an interest, and I think that's perhaps the appropriate thing for me to do in this case.
Thank you. Mr. Golden.
I would just like to highlight to the committee and anyone else watching that on my voluntary declaration of interest, there is an entry which highlights a trip by Conservative Friends of Israel to Israel in 2016.
Thank you. So this petition for consideration is petition number 2169, facilitate a review and upgrade of teaching resource Palestine and Israel, understanding the conflict, and it's lodged by Hugh Mitchell-Humphreys on behalf of Scottish Friends of Palestine. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to facilitate a review and upgrade of the teaching resource Palestine and Israel, understanding the conflict, to assist understanding and debate in the security of classrooms. The Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills response to the petition states that the teaching resource is not a Scottish Government or Education Scotland resource. The submission states that it is owned by the EIS and is therefore a matter for the EIS to consider if, when and how it wishes to update the resource. The petitioner has provided a written submission which states that the issue of ownership of the resource as an excuse for rejecting the petition is a red herring and untenable. He states that when the Scottish Government gave the go-ahead for the formation of the original working group to produce a resource in 2015, no contact of ownership was drawn up. The petitioner believes that the current situation and political sensitivities around the topic of Israel-Palestine, local authorities and schools should be supported with a balanced resource. Do members have any comments or suggestions for action? Mr. Russell.
While it's a very emotive issue, I would propose that we close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that the Scottish Government has been clear in its view that it is the EIS to decide whether to update the teaching resource. Given the clear view expressed by the Government, the committee is limited in the action it can take in this petition, as the matter is more appropriately addressed at an operational level by the EIS.
Thank you. I too shall decline to take a view, but are those colleagues able to express a view content to support the proposal? They are. Yes, so that means the petition will be closed. Petition number 2170 to abolish the General Teaching Council for Scotland. This has been lodged by Paul Blaker on behalf of Accountability Scotland. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to abolish the General Teaching Council for Scotland and replace it with a government agency. The petitioner believes that the General Teaching Council for Scotland, GTCS, is not supporting teachers' professional development, nor is it helping children to experience improved quality learning and teaching. The statutory functions of the GTCS are set out in a 2011 order, the purpose of which was to establish it as an independent, self-regulating professional body for teachers working in Scotland. Some of its main functions are to keep a public register, set standards for the teaching profession, investigate the fitness to teach for individuals, and provide advice to the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government does not see the ask of the petition to be practical or achievable, as it considers the GTCS to be effective in its statutory role. role. The government states that it cannot intervene in processes or decisions made by fitness to teach panels, adding that panel members are independent and not GTCS employees. The GTCS commissioned the Professional Standards Authority for Health and Social Care to undertake an independent review of its fitness to teach process. The PSA's findings highlighted some areas for improvement, such as reducing the time it takes to resolve cases, supporting vulnerable participants, simplifying public-facing guidance and documentation, and enhancing case management. The GTCS has committed to present an action plan to its Professional Regulatory Assurance Committee in light of those recommendations. The petitioner's additional submission brings forth further examples to illustrate his concerns that the GTCS is not meeting its core mission to uphold professional standards and protect pupils. So, very determined representation, but clearly one with the government taking an alternative view. Mr. Ewing.
I think this is rather similar to the previous petition, where we have received a substantive written submission, supplementary one from the petitioner, commenting on the Scottish Government's response. And in that submission dated the 5th of September, fairly recently, the petitioner makes some fairly fundamental criticisms of the Scottish Government's response. For example, he suggests that there's perhaps an inappropriate closeness between the Scottish Government and the GTC, as evidenced within the fact that 24 hours of its publication, the Scottish Government staff emailed senior figures at the GTCS, which kind of does raise questions about the independence of the GTCS. More significantly, the Scottish Government's response referred to the PSA criticism, and the PSA have, as you've said, Convener, made a very detailed report. It did add other criticisms, incidentally, for example, of the 5-year rule as being entirely arbitrary, which is absolutely correct. But the Scottish Government didn't actually mention the fact that the PSA report was fairly critical in terms of how these reports are normally shaped. It was very critical, in fact, indeed. Nor does the Scottish Government say that the equivalent of the GTCS in England was abolished in 2012. It just doesn't mention that at all. So plainly this is something that could be done. Now, I'm not advocating, I'm not taking a side here, but to give voice to the petitioner here, I do think we should go back to the Scottish Government to ask for a specific response on the points the petitioner has made, and ask if, in the light, and also ask in the light of the fact that the PSA report, and as I understand it, it's an independent body, the PSA, Professional Standards Authority, in the light of the fact that that report was critical in numerous aspects, you know, what exactly is going to be done to address these criticisms? It all looks to me as if the petitioners claim that there's a very cosy relationship between all these bodies, and that the leaders pass between one and another, and therefore the independence is theoretical but not real. There does seem to me to be potential substance in that, and I do think that, I'm not suggesting we call on the Minister to give evidence, because I'm aware of the timetable pressure. Otherwise, earlier on I would have, Convener, earlier on in the session. But in this particular case, I do think we should make those requests of the Scottish Government, specific response to the petitioner, and what they feel must be done in relation to pursuing the PSA recommendations, rather than it just drifting away and nothing happening, which is what so often is the case.
Thank you, Mr. Ewing. Mr. Ewing makes recommendations then on keeping the petition open and pursuing points of interest with the Scottish Government. Are colleagues content to do so? We are. Thank you. That brings us to petition number 2171, to stop the use of prisons for punishment and focus them on public protection, lodged by Robert MacDonald. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to stop the use of prisons for punishment and deterrence, and only use them for public protection purposes in order to reduce the pressure on the prison service and allow more focus on rehabilitation, thereby ensuring that those who pose the greatest risk are jailed, whilst allowing those who pose less of a risk to be given community orders, fines and potentially lifelong driving bans. The Spice briefing explains that prisons hold remand prisoners and sentenced prisoners, and remand prisoners are awaiting trial or sentencing following conviction, while those in the second category are serving a custodial sentence. A Scottish Government paper published earlier this year concludes that there is no single reason for the increase in the prison population, and therefore no simple solution to manage and tackle the issue. The Scottish Government's view on the ask of this petition is that due to the complexity of the matter, it is actually not practical or achievable in the short term. However, the Government reiterates its long-term ambition to use prisons only for those who pose a risk of serious harm. The response also points to various pieces of work aimed at shifting the balance between the use of custody and justice in the community. Most significantly, the Sentencing and Penal Policy Commission was established this year to establish the use and effectiveness of custodial sentences and community interventions, and the Commission is expected to make recommendations for dealing with offending behaviours effectively and proportionately, with the ultimate aim of ensuring the sustainability of Scotland's prison population in the long term. Finally, the Government reiterates that courts continue to have discretion in determining the appropriate sentence for any given case, which may include a custodial sentence if that is deemed necessary. Do members have any comments or suggestions for action? Mr Golden.
I recommend that the committee closes the petition under Rule 15.7 of the Standing Orders on the basis that, while the Scottish Government supports the broad aims of the petition, it considers that they can only be achieved in the long term. Furthermore, sentencing is a matter for the courts. And finally, the Sentencing and Penal Policy Commission is currently examining the effectiveness of sentencing and community interventions.
Mr Ewing.
Yes, I agree with that. But I just also reflect on the fact that imprisonment does serve various necessary purposes: incapacitation to protect the public, deterrence, to deter against future crime, rehabilitation, which is very important and challenging, but also punishment. And punishment is the price that people pay in losing their liberty for committing a very serious crime indeed. I don't think it can be morally justifiable to somehow elide punishment as a justification for imprisonment, because plainly I think it would be something the public would find very difficult to agree that punishment is not appropriate where someone commits a rape or a murder. Plainly, punishment is a necessary one of the functions of imprisonment, not the sole one, but one of the, and it must always be so, in my humble opinion.
Thank you, Mr Ewing. But you are supporting Mr Golden's recommendation?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Are colleagues content on that basis? We are. Thank you. So we thank the petitioner for raising the issue, but note the Scottish Government supports the broad aims, but also the comments of colleagues. But I don't think at this point there's anything the Petitions Committee would be able to do to advance further the aims of the petition in light of the submissions we've received. The final of our new petitions today is petition number 2173, which is to ban ultra-processed foods in school meals, and it's been lodged by Lauren Houston. And the petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to ban the use of ultra-processed food in school meals across Scotland in order to give our children healthier options. The Spice briefing explains that there is no single universally agreed definition for ultra-processed food. Examples of ultra-processed foods might include sweetened breakfast cereals, carbonated soft drinks or confectionery, and they might also include low-fat spreads or some flavoured yogurts. The Scottish Government's response to the petition states that all food and drink served in Education Authority and grant-aided schools in Scotland are under a statutory duty to comply with the nutritional requirements for Food and Drink in Schools Scotland Regulations 2020. Now, compliance with the regulations is monitored by Education Scotland Health and Nutrition inspectors as part of the school inspection programme. The Scottish Government's response states that current scientific evidence does not support a change to dietary advice in relation to consumption of ultra-processed foods, and notes that the evidence base remains of insufficient quality to propose changes at this time. The submission highlights that not all ultra-processed foods are unhealthy, with many playing an important part in ensuring food safety and standards. And the issue of processed and ultra-processed foods is kept under review by the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition. The submission notes that an outright ban on ultra-processed products would mean products like bread, yogurts and breakfast cereals would no longer be provided in schools, which in turn could have a significant impact on the nutritional content of school meals, including fibre, calcium and vitamins, some of which would be difficult to get in sufficient quantities from the other food sources excuse me, available. As such, a ban on ultra-processed products in schools is not currently considered by the Scottish Government to be in the best interests of child nutrition, in light of current scientific evidence and dietary advice. Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Convener. I think that the aims of the petition to ban ultra-processed food in school meals is quite a big ask, but nonetheless, I think the response from the Scottish Government is extremely disappointing. As you have highlighted, Convener, the Scottish Government say that an outright ban on ultra-processed food would mean products like bread, yogurts and breakfast cereals would no longer be provided in schools. I can't fathom how that's the case, and I'm happy to provide the Scottish Government with examples of bread, yogurt and breakfast cereals that can be provided that aren't ultra-processed. So I think it would be helpful if the committee write to the Scottish Government asking for a percentage of school meals provided that are fresh, which is one of the Scottish Government priorities. Their definition of sustainable produce, what I would consider be sustainable, but I think it would be useful for the Scottish Government to define that. Thirdly, I think, as I've highlighted, if they believe there are no alternatives to bread, yogurts and breakfast cereals that are not ultra-processed, and finally, if they can highlight and provide the data around how they monitor local authority provision of school menus in order that it's in the public domain and at least can help inform the petition. In addition, we might want to consider writing to providers, given the position we are and the need to progress quickly, providers of school meals. So, for example, in my region, Tayside Contracts would be one to ask for similar information, because I think it's important that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament do have an overview of provision across Scotland in this area.
Thank you. What kind of comprehensive set of suggestions, Mr. Golden? Do any colleagues have any other thoughts on the matter? And we're agreed, so we'll keep the petition open and we will seek the information of the Scottish Government as expressed by Mr. Golden. And that brings us to the end of our consideration of new petitions today and to today's proceedings. So I now close this meeting of the committee and note that we will meet again on Wednesday the 29th of October.